and welcome to an unloved, underappreciated little ramble of mine. I'm gonna stop short of calling this one a Ben's junk, though. So anyway, for reasons I've actually kind of forgotten, not too long ago I was chatting with a viewer in the YouTube comments, and it came up that I should do a video on albums that I love that I am supposed to hate. You know, albums that are hated by the critics, hated by fans of whatever artist, but I think are actually quite good. And I thought, yeah, that I've got, my favorites. So I picked an arbitrary number. Okay, I'll do like top 5. Well, as it turned out, I could only come up with 3 that I thought were very good to great. With never skipping a cut, or maybe only skipping one cut on the thing. So I had to retool things a bit here. So we're going to eventually have a top 3 of those albums that I am supposed to hate, but I really actually love, and then 2 honorable mentions. So we'll kick things off with the 2 honorable mentions here. And hell, let's just dive right in. So the first honorable mention here is from an artist who allegedly had 3 golden turkeys, if you will, throughout his career. One in the 70s, one in the 80s, and alas, what turned out to be his final effort in 2012 or 13, whenever that was. And if you know your rock history, you know who I'm talking about. That would be my vocal soul brother, Lou Reed. And so I'm not going to be discussing the 70s one, Metal Machine Music, which is a double LP sound collage. So you can't even really judge that like a conventional rock record, pop record, what have you. But even then, no, it did not need to be a double LP, but I don't think it's that bad. But yeah, he could have picked out the more eventful parts and consolidated it to like one side of one LP or less, and I think it wouldn't be quite as hated, at least. But yeah, I didn't think it was that deserving of its ire. Otherwise, I'm not going to be discussing the final turkey, the collaboration with Metallica, Lulu, which admittedly I have only ever heard parts of. From what I heard, I just wasn't enthused to hear the rest, so not discussing that one. Another qualifier is I have to own it and have heard it all the way through, obviously. So that leaves us with his 80s turkey, Mistrial, from 1986. We'll have a little mistrial for Mistrial. And I'd say this is about 7 out of 10. 10 cuts on here, I'd say 7 are keepers. I think that's a pretty good batting average. But I think the main reason this gets crapped on by the critics and fans is that it sounds 1986. It's got that, it's got drum machines for the most part as opposed to regular drums. And it's got that very bright, brittle 80s sound to it, mid-80s sound. But I think for the most part, it's a pretty good batch of songs. And really, the first 2 cuts alone, the title track and No Money Down, that alone keeps this away from golden turkey status, in my opinion. So, and of course, the video for No Money Down, that's kind of infamous in its own right, too. And indeed, I first saw that one when I was way too young to have seen it. I think I was 6. And I think it is finally on YouTube. It was conspicuously missing from the internet for a long time. But yeah, if you showed that to a 6-year-old, I could see where the kid would get freaked out by it. But another reason I think this gets dumped on by the critics is the track The Original Rapper. Now, of course, it's a bit of a pun there, W-R-A-P-P-E-R. But yeah, that would be Lou's little stab at rap. But by the same token, if any white boy rocker were qualified to take a crack at rap, wouldn't it be Lou Reed? I mean, that's kind of his delivery anyway. And, he's a New Yorker. I'm sure he knew about rap well before most people did. Granted, didn't record any of it till much later. But yeah, I don't think it's that bad. It's a cute little novelty in the context of the record. But yeah, the first 2 cuts and Tell It to Your Heart, 3 cuts there alone keep this well out of golden turkey status, in my opinion. The other honorable mention is an album that I think mostly just suffers because the expectations for it were so high at the time that even if it turned out really good, I think just by reputation, it would have been considered a bit of a disappointment. So with that, one of my favorite artists, starting when I was towards the end of middle school, has been Harry Nilsson. When I first heard Nilsson Schmilsson, I just latched onto it. I still love that album to this day, but that's generally considered a classic. But this would have been 1999 or so, and it was still kind of early internet, and a lot of his stuff hadn't found its way to CD yet. And so it became this long process of trying to just cobble together whatever Nilsson albums I could find. And one of the later ones was kind of, in a way, the white whale for me, and that would have been the one I'm going to discuss here, Pussycats from 1974. I guess you could say, collaboration with John Lennon, although Lennon does not appear anywhere on the record. He does not sing or play on it. And so with that, I first heard this, I think it was my 16th birthday. My parents took me to the Virgin Megastore in downtown Denver, and they allowed me to pick out like 3 or 4 CDs for my birthday. And one of the ones I picked out was the Buddha Records 25th anniversary, then recent 25th anniversary edition of this album. And I kind of, even in the relatively early internet era, kind of knew about this one by reputation. And so I was prepared for Harry's voice to be damaged. He ruptured a vocal cord very early on, or just before starting to make this, and tons of booze was flowing, and possibly some D-Rug-S drugs. But when I first heard that CD, it just seemed impenetrable to me. I'd never heard anything that was quite that dense. Well, as it turned out, it was more really one of my first encounters with just bad mastering. So that Buddha reissue it's brick-walled and it's way over-processed. It's got this very unnaturally bright EQ going on. And so that kind of screwed with it, because this is an album that was already very heavily compressed, already pretty heavily processed, and also pretty dense. I mean, there's a few cuts on here that have 3 drummers playing on it. I mean, they went full tilt Phil Spector with most of this thing. So, not too terribly long after, my other favorite haunt was Twist and Shout, and there was always the bargain bin, and I was raiding that bargain bin all the time. And one day they happened to have this copy of Pussycats in there, and in and of itself rescued from a cutout bin at some point. And so I dropped the 99 cents on this, and I'd already warmed up a bit to the album, but it wasn't until I put this on my turntable at home, my crappy little Sony turntable, that I really started to appreciate it, because it's really not quite that dense. It's really not that badly mixed. It was just, it had a pretty heartless remaster for that Buddha reissue. So anyway, if you know your rock history, you probably know about the Lost Weekend. Harry and John basically just drunkenly terrorizing LA. But yeah, this is the ultimate souvenir of the so-called Lost Weekend. But anyway, I was starting to show the track list here, and you might notice there's a lot of covers on this one. And when I first heard this, the only thing I really latched onto was the opening cut, Many Rivers to Cross, a cover of the Jimmy Cliff tune. And really, I'd kind of like to hear Cliff's vocal on Harry's arrangement of this one. Obviously, that's I don't think that's ever going to happen. I mean, Jimmy Cliff is still around, but there'd be no practical reason for it. But over time, I have kind of really grown to appreciate the track Black Sails more than anything else. It is Harry's ultra-ragged, screwed-up voice, and him singing over an orchestra. There was no rock instrumentation to it at all. But yeah, it's kind of an ugly song, ugly lyrics. Harry's voice is all messed up, but yet it just works. I can't explain it. There are a couple cuts on here that I could do without, really about the same batting average as that Lou Reed album. But yeah, this is my other big honorable mention here. So with that, let's get on to the top three. All right, on to my top three albums that I love that I am supposed to hate. So this one is the only really well-known infamous one that I'm going to cover here. This is the only one that routinely pops up in those worst album of all time sort of lists. Todd in the Shadows has done a Train Records on this one. But damned if I just don't love this album from end to end. I guess I'm just a sucker for the sound of a band falling apart. So with that, let's take a look at the final studio album from Creedence Clearwater Revival, Mardi Gras, from 1972. And the artwork alone, I love the artwork to this one. So anyway, by this point, Creedence was down to a trio. Tom Fogerty had left, John's brother, and the other two remaining members, bassist Stu Cook and drummer Doug Clifford, wanted to start getting in some of their own songs on a Creedence album, and I think John Fogerty was just tired and pissed off and ready to move on, and this was going to be kind of it no matter what. So he figured he would just let go of the wheel for this one. And so what we got here is even a split as you can get, I guess, between three members with a 10-track album. So we get 3 original tunes from each member, and then there's one cover. So there is some debate as to who plays what on this. There are some people that say John Fogerty does not play on the grand total 6 cuts that were written by the other 2 guys. But I think Fogerty actually contributed a lot instrumentally to this one. I'm pretty sure he is handling all the guitar and keyboard duties on this thing. But anyway, yeah, the main gripe is that, it's Creedence. It is supposed to be the John Fogerty band. So if you are willing to not take this as a conventional Creedence album, I think it's better than its reputation. Of course, I have this weird thing for albums where the band is falling apart. There's just more of an urgency to it. And honestly, you can dump on Stu Cook and Doug Clifford all you want, but I think they turned in some decent songs. Cook isn't much of a singer. Clifford was a decent singer. But yeah, we'll take a little look at the back there. So here's the 3 of them pretending to get along. But yeah, this is... it's not officially a divorce album, but it's a band divorce album, I guess you could say. There is, it's basically listening to the 3 of them hash out their problems with each other, but each tune's got a solid hook to it, and I just can't really dump on this. It's got 3 of my favorite John Fogerty tunes, 3 of the 4 that he's at the helm for, so Looking for a Reason, and Sweet Hitchhiker, and my personal favorite, Someday Never Comes. Which was a very appropriate farewell single from the group. But yeah, 10 cuts in like 28 minutes. This is a short album. But yeah, I just absolutely love this one, and I don't think it deserves the bad rap. But yeah, you cannot approach this one like you did Green River or Cosmo's Factory or one of those albums. All right, in the number 2 position is this one from the Allman Brothers, Win, Lose, or Draw, from 1975. And I think people mostly dump on this one for the circumstances under which it was made, as opposed to the end result. So up until this point, the Allman's albums had been not necessarily live in the studio, but fairly close. There was some sweetening going on, but everybody was there all at once, and there was some real electricity to their stuff. In this case, by this point, for one, their previous album, Brothers and Sisters, had been a huge hit. #1 album, had a top 5 single on it, Ramblin' Man, and that put them right at the top of the heap. But this was a band that already had some serious problems. They'd lost 2 members to motorcycle accidents in 2 years, and drugs were becoming a bigger problem. And by this point, Greg Allman was dating Cher. They may have even gotten married by this point, and Greg was hanging out in LA. The rest of the band was back in Macon, Georgia at Capricorn Studios where they normally worked. And so the tapes were being FedExed across the country constantly. And the whole thing just had to be pieced together. There's one cut on here where the engineer had to jump behind the drum kit. But by the same token, it's still some pretty electric performances as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's a really good set of songs here. Granted, there are only 7 cuts on this thing, but that's more because of the length than anything else. So anyway, this one, as far as my own deal with it, there's a track on here. It was also the single for this one. It's called Just Another Love Song, which to me is this really gorgeous Dickie Betts little mellow country rock tune. And it did not do very well on the charts, but it was one that I would hear like the old hippie DJs play back in Denver periodically. And it spurred me to pick this up. Now, at that time, this was just totally out of print. It had been on CD, but had fallen out of print. The remasters hadn't happened yet. So I had to scour the vinyl bins, and I finally did find a copy, and I just loved it. And yeah. So anyway, 7 cuts here, as I mentioned. We got a Muddy Waters cover. We got, I think, one of Greg Allman's best tunes, the title track. We got 2 Dickie Betts, real winners here, the Just Another Love Song and the instrumental High Falls. And yeah, I find it hard to really knock this album. There's no sign of poor performance anywhere. Yeah, I really think people just dump on this one because it was made under some not so hot circumstances. I think that's just kind of a given. But yeah, I absolutely do not understand the hate for this one. All right, moving on to my number 1 pick. And really, I'm only putting this at number 1 just because it's the more notorious and the more controversial one. As far as quality goes, to me, you could swap this out with the Allman Brothers album. But anyway, the album in question is Byrdmaniax by the Byrds from 1971. And you're just asking for trouble when you put your band in death masks on your cover. So anyway, the story goes with this one. This one's mostly hated for the production job, I should say up front. It's usually not dumped on for the songs too much. But what I think happened was the Byrds had become better known for being a live band by this point, and they had to get back on the road and fulfill some of those dates. So what I think they did was they entrusted their producer, Terry Melcher, who also worked with the Beach Boys and a bunch of others, to finish some overdubs that they just didn't have time for and to mix and get this thing out the door. And I don't think they actually heard this until it hit the street. So there's a tune on here, the best known cut on this thing, I Want to Grow Up to Be a Politician. It was an FM rock radio favorite for ages. You don't really hear it anymore. But that song, I'm convinced, was supposed to have horns on it from the get-go. Because if you took the horn section out, there'd be this huge gaping hole in the track. And so what I think happened was they intended to have Melcher do the horns for that one song and maybe embellish a couple other cuts. But I think Melcher got carried away and brought in a ton of session musicians, and most of the cuts on here got very, very heavily sweetened, as it were. And I also think he burned up the album's budget because it sounds like he ran out of money and he basically had to take whatever the monitor mix at the moment was, slap a compressor on it, and then just call that it. Because this is a muddy, throbbing sonic mess. So anyway, to me, it's the worst you could do with a really good batch of songs. Now, having said that, you think the Byrds, you think Mr. Tambourine Man, jingle jangle folk rock, but if you know their later stuff, you know that they totally broke from that about halfway through their run. And their later stuff is way more eclectic and it just had a lot more of an edge to it. You know, Roger McGuinn would still pick out his electric 12-string here and there, but nowhere near as much as he did early on. So really, by this point, the band had become a collective of effectively singer-songwriters, some maybe more reliant on covers than others, and everybody just had their own little thing, and you wind up with these much more eclectic albums. So in this case, you know, we bounce from like gospel to more traditional singer-songwriter stuff to a really grotesque tune about old Hollywood to the political satire, I Want to Grow Up to Be a Politician, to an early Jackson Browne cover, Jamaica Say You Will, which Browne hadn't done yet. And there's a bluegrass instrumental in there, Green Apple Quickstep, and on and on. So this is a much more esoteric album than that Allman Brothers one, but I really, really like this one. It's just that production job that is just such a problem. And I've also, you know, entertained the notion that maybe it's just bad mastering, but no, this is the original pressing here from the summer of '71, a pretty worn one, but it's a muddy, throbbing mess here. I even have this on reel-to-reel, and it's a muddy, throbbing mess on reel-to-reel as well, and I'll show you this is indeed an actual original copy. I've owned this on 2 CD issues of it, and it's no better on the CDs, and yeah, it's just a bad mix. So yeah, if anything, more than anything else, this is an album I would love to be able to have a crack at the multi-tracks and try and sort out. But I have a feeling that's never going to happen. I have a feeling nobody's ever going to get a shot at this. I would not mind seeing the Byrds equivalent to the Beatles' Let It Be Naked, but for me, I wouldn't necessarily drop the strings and horns, but I'd pull them back a bit and I'd try and go for a much more balanced mix than what's here. But yeah, damned if I don't love this album. And with that, I feel like I've rambled enough, so I'm going to close things out here. I'll talk to you again soon.